Okay, so now I'm going to go to our web page, and we shall see. This is the part I hate.
It's worth waiting though.
So we'll get things going. Oh, and there we are. Great, we are live. So let me turn the volume down on this iPad so I don't have to listen to that. Well, welcome everyone. And this is a very different type of STED talk this afternoon. We are usually a gathered group together with many graduate students from Cambridge University and from across the city. And we are sadly in an empty space today, but I'm very, very thankful that Professor Sarah Perrett has agreed to come even in the midst of our current lockdown, which is why we can't have a live audience, and so it is a bit sad, but we are definitely awaiting the release from lockdown and hoping that we'll be able to continue to do these as we go into the next term. So today will be a little bit different. We're going to do this more conversation style and interview style, rather than just a single talk and having Sarah have to speak to empty pews, which is not very kind. But we welcome you anyway to our STED Talks, and if you haven't been with us before, we are broadcasting to you live from St. Edward's Church in City Centre, Cambridge, where we have a group of scholars who study and pray throughout the week in the scriptorium, but we also have these talks to influence the broader community because of our conviction that theology and our work in the academy should stem and spring from the heart of the church, from the heart of a praying people. So trying to encourage all of you who are studying to take heart to the idea that your academic life is not separated from your faith life, but that these two join together, and that there is a great vision that we can have in a pursuit of faith and in a pursuit of what God has called us to in the academy. And so, in that vein, I'm delighted that Professor Sarah Perrett has joined us today. I'll just give you a little word on what Sarah has done and where she has come from, a little bit of her background, and then you'll get more in the talk as we go. Oh, and let me invite you also, if you do have questions for Sarah, if you're watching via you have to be watching via the YouTube link because that's the only link we have. There is a place that you can type in comments to the thing. If you keep those to questions, we'll try to look down and see some of those that come in, and we'll try to answer some of those as we get through our conversation. But Sarah is the principal investigator at the Institute of Biophysics at the Chinese Academy of Sciences in Beijing. She splits her time in normal circumstances between China and Cambridge. She is currently the course director at the Faraday Institute, the Center for Science and Faith in Cambridge. And Sarah had studied here. Sarah actually, as a graduate, did her PhD work at Cambridge University, got her PhD in protein chemistry, and she was awarded an OBE for her service in UK and China relations. She's published widely in her field and is the editor of various journals. And Sarah is joining us today despite COVID lockdown. We are acceptably distanced, and we are delighted to have her. And so today it's going to be more interview style, and just invite you to join us in this conversation. So Sarah, thank you for being with us. It's wonderful to have you, and thank you for coming out in the midst of a lockdown. But why don't we begin by just telling us a bit of your background, where you came from, how you got into science. Where did those passions emerge from when you were younger?
Well, I was born in Norfolk, grew up in Edinburgh, but with summers in Texas with grandparents. My other grandparents lived in the countryside in Scotland, so I was a city dweller, but my holidays were very much spent tramping through wildlife and seeing, particularly in Texas, seeing very interesting insects and wildlife. Mm-hmm. I could recognize all the common poisonous snakes from an early age, just in case I needed to tell somebody which one I'd been bitten by.
That's an interesting contrast between Texas and Norfolk, isn't it? That's two different worlds, isn't it? Oh, good. Go ahead.
So I grew up in a family that was quite academic, at least a strong emphasis on education. I learned languages as I grew up. I was sent to a Gaelic nursery school, and then I had a semester in Germany in primary school when my father was on sabbatical there. I studied German and French and Greek at school. I picked up a bit of Spanish one summer during university. And as a family, with my dad being an academic linguist, we had seemed like a steady stream of interesting people from different countries and different cultures visiting the house. So that was one stream. In terms of science, I think I was particularly interested in how living things work. I was quite drawn to studying medicine, which was my plan up until fairly last minute. Chemistry was always a strong subject. I did think about studying languages, but perhaps I rebelled and became a scientist. Although both my parents are linguists, my grandfather in Texas was a professor of chemistry. Having grown up on a farm picking cotton, he then managed to finish high school and put himself through a degree and a master's and a PhD.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. So you were with your grandfather on the farm in Texas when you went in the summers?
So he grew up farming. He was an academic most of his life, and then he retired to a ranch, and so we got to herd goats and cows and paint fences and
Did he
things like
share that passion with you? There's his kind of own passion for the sciences and.
I think definitely the strong emphasis and importance of education was something that came from him as well. I mean, because hearing his story of, he's the youngest of 12, and they grew up farming, but each of them went on to university, and they all became preachers or teachers, and the older ones helped the younger ones get through education. I definitely felt the sort of encouragement that this was important. He had a PhD in chemistry. My mother has a PhD in German literature.
No. Good. So how did your interest in the science, how did it kind of blossom to where you got to university and you began to study? You said you switched last moment from kind of a medical profession to science. How did that happen?
I think that was, I realized that I wasn't sure I wanted to practice medicine. I was definitely interested in medicine, but I was more interested in the molecular side. I've said that I was witnessing weird and wonderful wildlife, but actually I remember getting much more excited about cooking up concoctions of flowers in the kitchen to make pH indicators to see which colors of flowers would change color if you added acid like vinegar, or I'm not sure what I used for alkali. I was probably sodium bicarbonate. But yeah, that seemed to take more of my attention.
Wow. And so you came to Cambridge. How was your what was your experience like here as a graduate student? And at that point in your life, was your faith kind of inactive? Was it something strong in your life, or what was it like being at university in the sciences, which can tend to be somewhat I don't want to say anti-religious, but certainly not wanting to bring religious conversation into the discussion per se.
It was interesting. I mean, I grew up in a family that went to church, and so presumably I had heard everything, but it just made no impression on me until I was about 18, and I'd say that was when I became a Christian, although at that point it was quite a sort of private sense that God is there, He has a plan for me, and it's my choice whether or not to get on board with that. From there, I actually spent an extra year in Edinburgh at a college there doing a computer course, where I discovered I'm really not designed to write computer programs. My son, though, is doing computer science, so so actually that college experience was interesting from the point of view of being a Christian. I mean, I knew I needed to go seek out the Christians, and some older Christians there spent a lot of time with me, reading the Bible, explaining things to me, and that was very, very helpful. And that college, there was a very hostile environment. There was a very, very small Christian union, so maybe 10 people out of 10,000 students. So actually the contrast was going to Cambridge as an undergraduate, where the main Christian union was maybe 500 people on a given meeting. Wow. Each college had their own Christian union of at least 30 people or so. So actually it was, I remember doing an outreach at the college in Edinburgh, and we'd had an event with free food, and people wouldn't take it. And then you get to Cambridge, well, everyone goes to the Freshers CU events. I mean, why wouldn't you want free food?
Exactly.
So actually, I found Cambridge a much more welcoming environment, and over the years, I really benefited from the weekly Bible readings by very good speakers, and outreach events as well, which were also very, very good training, if you like.
Yeah. So you didn't feel, so you were able to get into a good group with the CU. Did you feel any of that kind of pressure in your academic work to, I guess maybe was there any kind of, I don't want to say anti-religious, that also sounds so strong, but was there any pushback against kind of any type of idea that you could have this faith but also be a scientist, or was that not an issue?
I think there were people of different opinions, but even the most, my PhD supervisor is Jewish and was very respectful of his group in terms of not just religious views, but if we wanted to carry on in academia, he was supportive of that. If we wanted to go and completely change field, he very much didn't dictate what he thought people should be doing, and he was very supportive. I think even the most antagonistic voices, say in the research group, also accepted that different people had different views.
Did that challenge you at all in your own faith? I mean, did you feel like you either needed to be more vocal, or did you need to kind of shrink back a little bit and maybe be less vocal, or did you feel that either of those feelings?
It can feel threatening, but no more than the way people behave just in day-to-day life in the lab. I think in academia generally, well, in life in general, you can't have, you have to have a little bit of a thick skin. You're always going to have people who disagree with you, and you need to be gracious, and hopefully they're gracious too.
Mm-hmm. Now tell us about your how did your post in Beijing come about, or how did your work in China come about? How did that happen?
So I stayed on and did a PhD in Cambridge, And then I was awarded a college research fellowship, which let me start my own project. And during my time as an undergraduate and graduate in Cambridge, one Christian activity I did get involved with was run by the Christian Union and also by the Christian Graduate Society, was a welcome program for international students. So it was run by Christians, but obviously it was welcoming whoever arrived that wanted to be welcomed. There were also coffee evenings and food events and so on. So that gave me an opportunity to meet people from all over. And I just felt over the years I tended to have more of an affinity for perhaps Asian visitors. And I started learning some Chinese, which may sound strange, but in our family, that's the first thing you do, isn't it?
Learn a language.
So yes, I started to make some Chinese friends and learn more about the language and the culture, and began to think about what was next. During that, I actually met my husband at one of these international coffee evenings, and he had spent. He's a medical doctor, so I can ask all the medical questions I want anytime I want. He had spent a year in Pakistan as a volunteer, and I think he had in mind he might go overseas in future as a doctor, but also in terms of my own thoughts, the interaction with international people made me think that, maybe I would think of going somewhere other than just the usual places, which in my field would be the US or maybe Germany. So the interest in China was on several angles. It was mostly through meeting people. I also started to pray for China and read about China, and I became really fascinated with the country and the people, and I think that was something that God gave me. So from there began to, I realized you could actually visit China, and so I think it was my final year as an undergraduate, I went and did a 6-week course there and traveled around a bit. And then my husband and I made a trip just after my PhD graduation. So at that point, that's when the science sort of, it became one story. I hadn't really thought about doing scientific research in China. Teaching maybe, but not research. But then a student in the lab was doing a PhD, but she'd previously been a lecturer in Peking University. And when my husband and I went there on holiday, she arranged for me to give a talk, actually at the institute where I'm now group leader. So that was my introduction to scientific research in China. At that point, you couldn't find things on the internet. You couldn't, no institution had its own website, and it was very difficult to find papers by individual people, so it really needed a personal connection.
Wow, that's fascinating how those two worlds came together, collided as it were. And did you find being a non-Chinese citizen, how was your reception there? I mean, did you feel like, you were obviously very different than your normal, and I have to assume that maybe many of the scientists there, well, I'm assuming, but were they male scientists, or were there just as many female scientists and researchers in the institute?
Interestingly enough, several of my key mentors have actually been women. Sort of women in China were very much expected to carry on working. There was always very good childcare, so there wasn't the same, I think particularly for the older generation, there wasn't the same women sort of dropping out of the higher levels of academia that you see in the West, but also actually you see now in China. I mean, now there's maybe 10% women in faculty, top level faculty positions in my institute and others. I certainly felt conspicuous as a foreigner, which has advantages and disadvantages. I mean, the process of actually ending up working there long term was a process, and it started with that first visit, followed by a more official visit, at which point there was a conversation about maybe coming back for a couple of years. And people were surprised that I'd be open to the idea, but then were very enthusiastic. I was offered a job, but also given the freedom to find my own fellowship funding, which is what happened. I was granted fellowships in the Royal Society and the Royal Commission for the Exhibition of 1851. So that allowed me to take the project I'd been doing in Cambridge with me to China, and I initially worked in the group of someone else, a woman in fact, Professor Zhou Junmei, so that was a real mentorship in assigning students to work with me, but being there by my side and us being one group, and gradually beginning to write grants initially. She would translate my English version, and then gradually working with my own group as I started to form one to be able to apply for grants as a team.
Wow. And did you ever feel, I mean, it's amazing that you had so many women mentors in your path. I mean, did you ever feel challenged as a woman in kind of higher academia, as in potentially a more male-dominated field? I mean, were there any struggles that you had that some other females might be struggling with?
Yeah. I mean, to some extent, I didn't in my particular path in China. And I think there were particular things of my situation in China that I could afford to have a nanny. I could afford to send both children to nursery, and even though I was on a Chinese salary, that was still a fraction of my Chinese salary. I think a very big struggle in the West is that by the time you have two children, you're paying one person's salary. A very, very key factor was that I have an extremely supportive husband, and he actually chose to work part-time the whole way until our children were well into secondary school. So, I mean, what I see among Chinese colleagues is there are women doing excellent science in China, and there are couples who are both, professors and running separate research groups. But there are a lot of cases where, as a couple, they will make the decision that it's just too tough to have two professors, and that's the same here. Because having been promoted to group leader, to a lot of extent, you are your own. I'm the team leader of my team, and my interaction with the hierarchy is really the only. I have several bosses, but that you interact. Several times a year rather than on a daily basis. But I do see it. I mean, I suppose in China I'm using a second language, and I have had to really learn. With a second language, it's very easy that if you understand what someone says, that you take it as that is what they mean. And that is often not the case. But I find it in the UK as well. Since I've been back, I've been involved with various different departments, and I see a real communication issue between men and women. And I guess what I would say to women is, no, you don't need to behave like a man, but you need to be able to communicate with men and understand what men are saying. And I think that's really a challenge.
I think that communication, especially in an academic field, where you're trying to, especially when you're trying to articulate your ideas or your science or your theories or something like that, how that, I hadn't thought about that bridge between kind of just a male and female, or that gap, I should say, between male and female, how that can affect your, well, not only just your research, but your whole kind of experience and
I think it's less in scientific communication. It's more in the soft areas of, speaking to people above and below you in the hierarchy, and more departmental politics, if you like, or that promotions is an issue. And the fact is that a lot of women who've done well in academia do behave like a man. They, if you're over, you have to be very thick-skinned, not to spend a lot of your time doubting yourself. I mean, that's not to say that men don't think the same things, but they don't say that.
Sure. Yeah, well, I guess there's a difference. If you're in the majority of the group, then you just have a certain, even if you have a lack of confidence, you still have a certain level of confidence that might be different. That is, if you come into it either as a woman or maybe a minority or something like that, and to feel confident in your own voice in that environment, I can imagine would be really a challenge. Now tell us about your current research. What are you passionate about? I've looked a little bit on your bio and about proteins and things of that nature. So tell us, fill us in. There was one phrase that I loved on one of your website bios. Oh, and I'm going to forget what it was, but it was what you were interested in. It rhymed. It was really beautiful. I forget what it was. It was 2 words that I had to look up in the dictionary because I didn't know what they were. But anyway, tell us about your current research.
Well, we study most of our research is at the molecular level, which I said from the beginning that's I like mechanisms. So. I mean, actually, at the point where I was wondering about doing a PhD and what to work on, I'd spent one summer in a lab in Texas that was a botany, biochemistry lab. And I actually got to pick cotton, like my grandfather did, in a greenhouse, covered in ants, and then try and grind up cotton wool to get enzymes out of them. But so I'd sort of, that I'd had these tastes of doing research and realized it was hard work and it doesn't work most of the time. But I think I was attracted by that, asking questions and seeking answers, and you don't know quite where it would lead. So in terms of choosing a subject, I was sort of torn between liking the experiments that you do in physical chemistry, but being much more interested in biological or medical questions. And then actually my director of studies as an undergraduate pointed out the PhD research group I ended up in, where they were applying really physical chemistry techniques to biological questions. So it was a really nice fit. So yeah, so I did, and I continue to study proteins. which are long chains of amino acids, like beads on a string, and they have to generally fold up to form a structure, and it's once they're in that structure that they can carry out their function. But it's not a rigid thing. They can sort of unravel and refold. So I guess my earliest PhD work was looking at proteins breathing and unraveling, and which parts are more stable than others. And then there are these helper molecules called molecular chaperones that can help proteins fold. So I studied some of those interactions. At the point that I was choosing a project for my college research fellowship, I heard about prions and mad cow disease, and also prions in yeast. So that interested me, and so I started working on that and purified. Was one of the first people to purify one of the yeast prion proteins, and I've actually, among other things, have been studying that same protein ever since. So it's produced quite a lot of, I think, over 20 PhD theses.
Wow.
But yes, we look at how it folds, how it misfolds. Sometimes proteins, usually this functional structure will be relatively stable. So it's like it's sitting in a nice, safe, energetic basin. But sometimes things can happen that sort of push it out of the bathtub, and it can find a place where it forms more sort of layered structures. And these amyloid fibrils, they're called, are associated with various different diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and diabetes.
That was the word I was looking for, amyloid. That was the one I remembered. I looked up in the dictionary.
So we study, we use biophysical techniques to study the mechanisms of these folding and misfolding events.
So now I'm going to put you on the spot. So if you had to preach on proteins, how would you connect, or what let's see, how do you, this is a hard question, how do you find God in proteins? What is it in this kind of remarkable kind of molecular structure, this molecular kind of phenomena in proteins that you've been studying that reminds you of, can be anything generally, in terms of faith or in terms of God or in terms of just...
I mean, in terms of science and faith, I think it's interesting a lot of the earliest very famous scientists were devout Christians, and studying science was investigating God's world, and there was not seen to be any conflict. Sadly, the church thought otherwise, but I definitely, I mean, I'm not sure I could preach on proteins, but I definitely don't separate out being a scientist, being a practicing scientist and being a practicing Christian. I have often come across the idea that, for example, doing full-time Christian work is better than a secular career. And I would disagree with that. I mean, you asked for a talk title, and I said science is a vocation. I mean, what I mean is that I think we all have a vocation as a Christian. What is it that God has called us to do or is asking us to do? And it's not, having a faith is not a Sunday thing. It's not those activities you do outside work or school, or it's a way of life. And I think, I mean, the point where I became a Christian, that was what struck me, meeting people for whom faith was a way of life, that it wasn't just being seen to go to church on Sundays. It was very much reading the Bible every day, praying all the time. All decisions were things that God was interested in. So in terms of working, I'd always be trying to apply the principles of love the Lord your God with all your soul and mind and strength, and to love my neighbor as myself. And I think, you can begin to think, what does that mean, running a research lab? Well, how do I treat the people who are in my team? Am I concerned for their welfare? Am I concerned for their career progression? Or am I, you can see examples where graduate students are used as slaves to progress someone else's career. And I mean, I found in practice that having a motivated team, it benefits everybody. And, when people are ready to move on, they need to move on. I think that was the example I was shown by my PhD supervisor as well, that concern for the individual, not just about what we can achieve as a group.
Yeah, and I'm sure that's incredibly important, how the team dynamics, because so much of what a lot of researchers in academia are usually isolated, but in the sciences, as you were saying before, you are in these teams, and how you act and how you love the Lord and love your neighbor as yourself is probably incredibly powerful in such a situation like that, because I would imagine that there's not many situations where you're so isolated with a group of people day in and day out studying these things, that actually just how you treat one another and how you treat your students or your researchers, research assistants, how that is such a demonstration of faith in that. But let's go back to proteins, because I want to ask you, I'm fascinated by this stuff, because I'm so far from being a scientist. But if you were to say in your research, did you ever have a moment in your research where you thought, maybe you're researching proteins, how they fold, how they maneuver? Was there ever a point where you just said, or stepped back and said, this is just a miracle, like this is just beyond, like this is, and just maybe step back and just said, God, I praise you for this, because this is just unbelievable how this works, or how, what I'm discovering about it. Did you ever have you had one of those moments?
I think probably more in, seeing proteins fold, you're actually using quite a lot of imagination, because you don't see it directly. You infer it from rather boring, well, I don't find them boring, but you would probably find them a little mystifying, kinetic curves and such like. I do get excited about mechanisms, but I must say some of the images from cell biology and also from astronomy are just amazing. And I think it is amazing the way that the world is set up in terms of the physical constants, that they're just perfectly tuned, that this world can be the way it is. That proteins can be this string of beads on a string, and just by the sequence, that protein knows how to fold. It is remarkable. And some people say that's not that's irrelevant in terms of God. That's no proof that he exists. You're never going to prove that he exists, but the fact that gravity is, if it was slightly off, life wouldn't be here. If the properties of carbon or water were different, life wouldn't be here. And you can say, oh well, it is what it is, and if it hadn't happened that way, we wouldn't be here, so we wouldn't be thinking about it. But I think that's been compared to being lined up in front of a firing squad, and the command comes and they shoot, and then you walk away unscathed. You could say, well, it is what it is. If I hadn't walked away unscathed, I wouldn't be thinking about it. But I think you'd ask, who swapped the bullets for blanks, and why?
And why, exactly. Yeah, no, that's very true. That's very true. And now, in your research, do you mainly focus on the foldings of the proteins, or do you focus on also how that has an effect on the human body, or is it in kind of, because you were saying you were looking at, in Texas you were looking at the proteins in cotton. So is it mainly, does your research kind of relate to, is it more specifically on what the protein is doing, or is it kind of broader in terms of how this affects us, or how proteins work within our bodies, or things like that?
Yeah. So personally, or at my research group, we tend to look at the proteins in isolation. So like we extracted them from cotton enzymes. We also usually purify our proteins, and we have a limited number of proteins in the test tube at any one time. But definitely the purpose, the aim of the research is to understand how the fundamental properties of those proteins and the fundamental properties of the processes by which they fold or misfold. We do use some cells, and so we can look at how some of these proteins behave in cells, or if we add them to cells, whether, for example, if they're toxic to the cells. But I'm happier at the molecular level.
keep it at the molecular level. And now, so currently, so you're back, so COVID regulations have kind of grounded you back in Cambridge. And you've been at the Faraday Institute. For how long have you been at the Faraday Institute?
I started in June.
Started in June. Okay, so relatively recently. And you've taken over as course director. So tell us about your role there, and what's been happening. Obviously, it's been starting since June. It's been a bit different.
It's been interesting starting a new job, meeting people online and working with people online.
I can imagine.
But so the Faraday Institute is a Christian organization that works to help people's understanding of both science and religion. So that would be, for example, supporting scientists who are Christians, but also helping Christians and church leaders to be able to engage helpfully with scientific issues like bioethics. There might be questions that come up among congregations, getting Christians to engage with protecting the environment, maybe the implications of AI, those sort of topics. We try to help church leaders and other Christians grapple with the issues involved, even if they don't have a scientific background. But then also we have a wider reach in terms of of running courses open to people of any faith or none, looking at the discussion about science and faith and how they interact.
Yeah. There is actually that brings a question to mind, going back to your cotton studies, because one of the big things in the States is using genetically modified crops. And I'm just curious, it just popped into my head, but did you ever study anything that had been genetically modified in terms of its proteins, and how that, I don't know if you've ever done that.
No,
That just popped into my head. When you talked about Texas, and then all of a sudden when you were talking about the environment, I thought, oh yeah, what about kind of GM foods, and how what happens to proteins in those instances?
I'm sorry, that's outside my
That's
field.
that's fine. Just came into my head. And so what have you enjoyed about the kind of your role in the Faraday? What do you envisage your role in the Faraday Institute to be? I mean, how do you feel like that's going to kind of complement what you've been called to in terms of your scientific research and in terms of your Christian faith?
Well, I mean, I'm still running my lab in Beijing, though, as you say, due to COVID, I haven't been able to visit regularly, and the Faraday job is a part-time role, but it gives me it's really nice to be part of that community in Cambridge. I think it's very complementary in the sense of not separating out my science from my Christian faith. And I've certainly seen in China, people are generally brought up with the idea that being a scientist and being a Christian are completely incompatible. And I think the work of the Faraday helps break down those sort of barriers, because science and faith are not in conflict, they're complementary.
Yeah. I mean, have you seen, or what, maybe I should ask, what is your opinion of how, maybe in this time of COVID, how we've seen kind of the science come to the forefront of political decisions? I mean, do you have any thoughts or opinions on that? I mean, I think there's, because it's not often that science is really dictating kind of government policy, but certainly in this COVID crisis it has. I mean, I don't know if you have any opinions about it. Maybe you do, you don't want to share them, but...
I think it raises very interesting questions and very important questions about science communication, and the way that scientists communicate when communicating in a scientific way versus meaningfully communicating with the general public, including policy and decision makers. I mean, I was aware of the news during the BSC and mad cow disease crisis and the appearance of new variant CJD, and I remember being struck by newspaper reports saying, well, there's no proof that these two things are linked, and then finding out that it's the same protein, the same disease, the same gene. But scientists, they're not going to say that these are the same thing in a scientific paper. But it's barn dare obvious that there's a connection. So that I think that was a real two different types of communication. And then with COVID as well, I think it's a shame that it's perceived as a series of U-turns based on science. I think the thing that people need to understand is that the science is evolving, that this is a completely new disease. We've learned so much about it in a few short months. Already treatment methods have been significantly changed and outcomes are better. To be able to produce vaccines on this time scale is extraordinary. There's been an amazing coming together of the scientific community from different fields, and really extraordinary sharing of results and data. I think that's a very positive thing, but I think there's still a lot to be done in terms of communication between scientists and decision makers, and how those decision makers communicate to the general population.
Yeah, I mean, I was watching the news last night, and I can't remember if it was Professor Chris Whitty or one of the scientific advisors for the government said something to the extent of, during Christmas you can go and visit your granny, but you can't hug her because if you do, it may be the last time you do. I thought to myself, well, that's not really the way to communicate. I understand what your point is, and I understand that we don't want to transmit this virus, especially to the ones we love. But I do find it fascinating that we're experiencing a time of where a government and governments around the world have relied on kind of scientific evidence to determine how we behave as physical human beings, and I wonder where that balance is, especially as we, as part of our humanity and our physicality is so linked to our faith, and to what we believe and what we experience as human beings, and that physicality is being dictated to by government, which is being influenced by the science, and it's not to say that they're trying to dehumanize us by any means, but yet I feel like, when a statement like that comes out, kind of goes back to your point about communication. I'm like, is that really the best way, to communicate, to kind of, it's almost just this terrible threat, that you can't give someone a hug anymore, even within your own family, for fear of spreading this virus. Anyway, it is an interesting point. Well, let me finish with my last question, and then we'll see if any questions have come in via the live stream or whatnot. But I guess the last thing is do you have any advice, any kind of encouragement for either young scholars, some young academics who are here, those who are kind of embarking or trying to finish their PhDs, who are entering into fields that may whether they're men, women, or minorities. I mean, is there anything that you'd like to pass on kind of from your own experience?
I think mostly I would reiterate the idea of not separating the sacred from the secular. That, as a graduate student, you may be considering, who do I marry, what career do I follow? You may be thinking, do I want to go become a minister or some other full-time Christian worker? Or, no, I don't feel called to that, then I'll just get an ordinary job. I would say don't think like that, that, God may well call you to be a historian or a scientist or work in a bank, but don't say that one type of job is somehow a higher calling. God has a plan for each of our lives, and we shouldn't think that our day job is our own sphere, and God's only interested in Sundays. It needs to be an integrated life.
Great. Yeah, that's one of the things that we're trying to encourage in people, so thanks for reiterating that. So we've got a couple questions here, so let's see. I just had a couple come up on my phone. Let me see if I can read this one out. Okay, so this is from one of our graduate students. So they write, does the complexity of molecular processes in biological systems that you've studied have a bearing on larger scale scientific paradigms, such as materialism versus physicalism or neo-Darwinism, for example? And if so, in what way? So I guess on a micro level, do they expand to a kind of larger macro level things?
To the extent that I understand the question, I mean, it's often presented as science and faith being in conflict, because as Christians we believe that God created everything, and some people's interpretation of the Bible seems to be at odds with science. I think it's important to say that scientific questions and religious questions are looking at things from different angles. On the one hand, I believe that the world was created in such a way that the physical constants, which also govern biological processes, are such that through some process that includes evolution, that we have what we have today. Scientifically we don't know all the details, and we may never know all the details, but we can continue to investigate it. But that's not at all at odds with also knowing that God created it.
Yeah. Good. Oh, we've got another one here. This is a very good question. I like this. This is from Mandy. Have you sometimes found more puzzlement or wariness in faith communities about the compatibility of science and religious belief than you have amongst your scientific peers who don't profess a faith?
Sorry.
Have you found more puzzlement or weariness within the church, than with your actual scientific colleagues?
I think you get different views in both places. There's certainly some branches of the church that are very wary of science, particularly evolution, but also other things as well. Which I do find that is quite unhelpful in terms of putting an unnecessary stumbling block in people's ways.
Yeah. I think some people can be a little bit overwhelmed by the idea of science faith. I think part of that is just our cultures, the kind of constant voice of the culture saying that science can't coexist with religion, that religion is a private matter. And I think a lot of people, maybe even in the church, have kind of been so saturated in that particular view that they almost feel like it's difficult to see how the two can come together.
Well, a substantial proportion of practicing scientists are Christians, or at least believe in God. And obviously the percentages are different in different countries at different times, but I think the statistic from about 10 years ago in the UK was about 50% of scientists believe in God. And the number was about the same 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. So, 100 years ago, the surprise was that only 50% of Christians scientists believed in God, and now the surprise is really that many scientists believe in God. It's actually stayed fairly constant. Yeah. There are many scientists, very high-level scientists, who are very devout believers.
Well, and it's also this again, this cultural idea, and I think this is maybe just part of our, part of a secular society, is the idea that has been promoted, is this idea that once you gain kind of an answer about something, let's say through empirical study or whatever it is, then questions of faith no longer apply. You know, I think it's this very false system of saying, you know, because I know, you know, the photosynthesis of a plant or how the protein you know, acts in the plant, then all of a sudden I've discovered what God does, so there's no more question, you know, no more need for
nothing left for him to do.
There's nothing left to discuss.
Yes. I think it's a fairly fundamental misunderstanding about the scope of both science and religious thought. I mean, it's like saying the kettle's boiling because I'm putting in electrical energy to heat the water molecules. They're vibrating more, they're transitioning from a liquid into a gas, and so the kettle's boiling. Or the kettle's boiling because I put it on to make a cup of tea. And, you know, we can study the physics of water boiling till the cows come home, but we won't know who put the kettle on and why. And neither is me putting the kettle on going to tell us anything about the physics of water boiling, nor is it, you know, knowing the physics isn't going to make me any less able to boil the kettle. Mm-hmm. So I think it's, you know, they're complementary, they're not the same.
Yeah. All right, well, we'll end with one more question, and I thought this was a good one to end on. So this is a question from one of our grad students. Do you have a sense of why you might have been drawn to China in particular as opposed to elsewhere, and that God was perhaps leading you there for a particular reason? Did you feel a sense of, how did you know that this was the kind of place that God was calling you to go?
I think I mentioned that my interest in China coincided with starting to pray for China and meeting Chinese people. And I do believe that having such a strong affinity and interest was given to me by God. And, you know, I think going to China was following the path he had for me. In terms of purpose, I mean, you know, I've learned a lot, and it's shaped me a lot, and to some extent, you know, it was, I think I needed to take that step to learn the lessons that God wanted me to teach me. I don't know about what other purposes, but I guess time will tell.
Yeah. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for being with us today and for coming in the midst of a lockdown. It's really a blessing to have you, and thank you for just all that you've opened up today about, let alone about proteins, but about science and faith and the idea of these two. I think it's just such a beautiful thing when these two blend together in just as God is unveiling the mysteries of His creation, and you get to study them on such an intimate level, and with people from around the world, which is amazing. But very exciting and very just very thankful to have you with us today. Usually everybody would give you a round of applause, but there's no one in here. There's no one in here today. Sorry. But for those of you who are joining via the live stream, thank you so much. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for being with us today. You know, these are extraordinary times, so we have extraordinary STED Talks to bring to you live via live stream. But it's been a joy, and hopefully you've enjoyed this talk as well. And do keep in touch via the website. You can look at our STED Talks. We've got an exciting lineup for the Epiphany term. We'll begin at the end of January with with Simeon Zoll, who is a lecturer in the divinity faculty at Cambridge, speaking on his new book on the Holy Spirit. Highly recommend it. If you'd like to read it, get it for a Christmas present and read it and be ready for our first talk in the new year. And we have some other speakers lined up as well, which will be posted on the website. So once again, thank you so much. Thank you, Sarah, for joining us. And we hope you all have a blessed day and hopefully and a blessed Christmas, Advent and Christmas as we come into this wonderful season. We pray that you would be safe with your family and friends, and that you would be blessed in those who are coming back to Cambridge or will be in Cambridge in the new year. And we look forward to seeing you then.